All right, welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive in again.
Always.
This time we're looking at, well, it's a lot of stuff, mostly from, mostly from a U.S. perspective. So a lot of U.S. news, and kind of all over the place. We've
Yep.
got wild weather, political dramas, international relations stuff, even some corporate shakeups. So a lot to cover.
It's amazing how a lot of these things, they seem totally unrelated. But when you look at them together, you start to see like these bigger trends,
Yeah,
these tensions that are kind of shaping everything.
absolutely, absolutely.
It's all connected.
Yeah. Okay. So first up, I think it helps to just kind of paint a picture here. So, imagine like heavy rain, floods, rock slides, power outages, kind of the chaos that we've been seeing with all these severe winter storms across the U.S.
Yeah.
Kentucky, in particular, got hit really hard,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, the governor had to declare a state of emergency there. It's kind of it's just a reminder of like how powerful nature can be, right?
Oh, yeah.
And how important like disaster preparedness is.
Absolutely. And, it's this whole situation, I think it really brings FEMA's role into focus.
Yeah.
Because Trump, he's actually proposed like downsizing, maybe, complete getting rid of FEMA.
Hmm.
And think about this, like with climate change. We're probably going to see, more and more of these intense weather events, right?
Right.
More frequently, stronger storms, all that. So what happens if like individual states are suddenly left to just, deal with all these disasters like on their own
Yeah, it's a good question.
without any help? I mean, can you imagine the strain on resources,
Yeah.
the economic fallout? I mean, the impact on people's lives would be huge.
Yeah. I mean, I guess some people would argue that, states are better equipped to kind of handle their own issues,
Mm-hmm.
like a more localized approach.
Mm-hmm.
They might say that's more efficient, but then wouldn't that leave, smaller states or states that, maybe don't have as much money at a real disadvantage?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge point. I think having a federal agency like FEMA, it allows them to, pool all the resources, all the expertise, and it provides like this safety net
Mm-hmm.
for every state,
Yeah.
regardless of, how much they can do on their own. So getting rid of FEMA could lead to a system where like some states are just left incredibly vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
really struggling to recover.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Okay, well, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about a different kind of storm that's brewing. This one, this one's in the political arena.
Okay.
So there are some pretty serious allegations going around about the Justice Department. The suggestion is that the Trump administration might be, they might be using it for political gain.
Yeah, and what's really concerning is this case with the New York City Mayor Eric Adams. So the Justice Department, they supposedly stepped in and they dropped corruption charges against him.
Wow.
And get this, a New York prosecutor actually resigned in protest over this.
Wow.
I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Is the Justice Department really acting independently,
Right.
or are they being influenced by, political agendas?
Yeah, I mean it's not even just about this one case, right? It's
Yeah.
about like, is there a potential for this to like erode this fundamental principle, that the Justice Department should, be free from political pressure. It's like that old saying, right? Justice is blind.
Exactly.
But what happens if justice starts like peeking through the blindfold?
Yeah, I mean, that blindfold, right? It's a symbol of impartiality, fairness.
Yeah.
If that's compromised, then people start to lose trust in the legal system.
Yeah.
And it really makes you question whether the law is being applied equally.
Yeah, and we're seeing kind of echoes of this pattern, I guess, with Trump demanding lists of FBI agents that were involved in investigating the Capitol riot. It,
Mhm.
it seems like he's trying to like exert control over the very people who are supposed to be investigating potential wrongdoing. You know what I mean?
It definitely raises concerns about, the balance of power,
Right.
whether those checks and balances are being weakened. Those are the mechanisms that are supposed to stop any one part of the government from getting too powerful.
Yeah.
It's like a three-legged stool. Each leg is a different branch of the government that keeps everything stable. But if one leg is weak,
Right. Right.
the whole thing becomes unstable.
Yeah. No, that's a good analogy. Okay, so we've got, political storms brewing at home. Now, let's zoom out a little bit to the global stage, where, the war in Ukraine is still going on.
Yeah.
But there's this kind of interesting side story that's developing, and it involves this negotiation between Trump and Zelensky.
Okay.
And it involves something kind of unexpected, Ukraine's rare earth minerals.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I know, right? So these minerals, they're like essential components in all kinds of things, smartphones, electric vehicles, even advanced weaponry.
Right.
And you know how everybody's like, all this talk about electric cars and renewable energy.
Mhm.
Well, rare earth minerals are like absolutely crucial for those technologies.
Yeah, and you know who really dominates that market right now? China.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see why these minerals are like suddenly everyone wants them.
Right, yeah.
They're like bargaining chips in this whole war. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's like something out of a spy thriller or something.
Yeah, I know, right?
So the report is that Trump offered military aid to Ukraine, but in exchange for 50% development rights to these mineral deposits.
Wow.
But Zelensky's kind of hesitant. He's, worried about national security and he's demanding guarantees of protection from Russia. So
Yeah.
it's like this high stakes poker game with global implications.
It is. It really is. And the outcome of this whole thing, I mean, it could completely reshape the global landscape for these crucial resources. Whoever controls the rare earth minerals, I mean, they basically control who leads the way in technological innovation, right? Which means they control a lot of economic and geopolitical power.
Wow. So this negotiation, right?
Yeah.
That's happening in this war-torn region. It could actually like have ripple effects like throughout the whole world.
Oh, yeah.
Impacting the future of like technology and economics.
It really highlights how much everything is connected. What happens in one part of the world
Right.
can impact, global markets, technology, even the balance of power. Like it's like this giant web, right? You tug on one strand over here.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole thing vibrates.
Wow. Yeah. No, it really is. It's pretty mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
It's a lot.
yeah, so we've got this, this negotiation going on with rare earth minerals.
Right.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit, back to the U.S. Remember we were talking about those shockwaves in the scientific community?
Yeah.
Well, they're coming from Trump's proposed cuts to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health.
Right.
They fund a lot of, medical research in the U.S. And we're talking about like a 50% reduction in certain research grants.
Wow.
The kind that, cover like the basic costs of doing research, like keeping the lights on in the labs,
Right.
maintaining equipment, all that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, imagine you're a researcher, right? And you're working on this really promising treatment for Alzheimer's. You've been making progress, things are moving along, and then suddenly, boom, your funding slashed.
Yeah.
You can't afford to pay your lab staff.
Right.
You can't even keep the equipment running.
Right.
I mean, that's the kind of impact that these cuts could have, stalling vital research, delaying breakthroughs that could, potentially help so many people.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to kind of get lost in the numbers, right?
Right.
But those numbers represent real people,
Exactly.
real scientists working on real problems that affect all of us.
Yeah.
It just feels like we're like sending this message that science isn't a priority.
Yeah, it's a bad message.
And what kind of message does that send to young people who are, maybe thinking about a career in science?
That's a really good point. If we want to stay like a global leader in innovation, scientific discovery, we got to invest in the next generation of scientists. These cuts, they could really discourage people from going into research.
Yeah.
And that could have, consequences for years to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's almost kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about these cuts to scientific research, but at the same time, like China is pouring tons of resources into their own research and development programs.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're falling behind in a race that we can't afford to lose.
It's a strategic competition. There's no doubt about it. And China, I mean, they're serious about science and technology.
Yeah.
If we don't step up, we risk losing our edge, in all these fields that are crucial for the economy, national security, global leadership, everything.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so we've got, potential setbacks in scientific progress. Let's talk about this House budget proposal that's causing all this controversy.
Okay.
So it includes cuts to Medicaid,
Mm-hmm.
which provides health care to millions of Americans,
Right.
low and middle income seniors, people who, rely on programs like SNAP to help put food on the table.
These cuts they're especially concerning because they really hit the most vulnerable people the hardest.
Yeah.
People who already have a tough time accessing healthcare,
Right.
affording basic necessities. It's like pulling the rug out from under them.
Yeah. And then on top of that, the same budget is proposing tax cuts. But these tax cuts, they mainly benefit like the wealthiest 1%.
Wow.
It's like the classic case of, robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? How does that align with the idea of a just and equitable society?
It's really about priorities, isn't it? Are we a society that takes care of all its members, makes sure everyone has at least a basic safety net, or do we favor policies that really just benefit those who are already well off? I mean, that could make existing inequalities even worse.
Yeah.
It's a debate that really gets to the heart of who we are as a nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of values, let's pivot a little bit to to the world of international relations. So we saw recently that 3 Israeli hostages that were being held by Hamas were released, and Netanyahu came out and praised Trump, gave him credit for their safe return.
Yeah, and you also had Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who expressed strong support for Israel's policy.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, towards Hamas, which the U.S. considers a terrorist organization.
Right.
So these statements, they really kind of reinforce, that close relationship between the U.S. and Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and those shared security concerns that they have in the region.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation, to say the least. I mean, on the one hand, it's great news that these hostages are released,
Yeah,
Families are reunited.
absolutely.
But then on the other hand, you have to look at the bigger picture, right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all the complexities there.
Yeah, it's important to remember that this conflict, it goes way back,
Right.
and it's about competing claims to land, resources, political power. It's really complicated. Any kind of solution, it requires a deep understanding of both sides' perspectives
Yeah.
and a real commitment to finding a peaceful solution that works for everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there aren't easy answers when it comes to international diplomacy, right?
No.
It's all about navigating, these complex relationships, balancing these competing interests, and trying to find, some kind of solution that promotes peace and stability.
Exactly. And it takes a real commitment to dialogue, empathy, a willingness to compromise.
Absolutely. Speaking of complex international dynamics, Jaydev Vance, the author, the venture capitalist, he was at the European Security Conference recently.
Right.
And let's just say his message didn't quite land as smoothly as he might have hoped.
Yeah, it was a bit ironic, actually. So he was there talking about, concerns over freedom of speech in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But his presence was met with, kind of a mixed reaction. Some European leaders, they were basically pointing out that, the U.S. isn't exactly a shining example of free speech these days.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of have a point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got our own controversies, with vaccine misinformation, book censorship, all these attempts to control the narrative. It's like that saying, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
Exactly. It just highlights this growing skepticism towards the U.S., and its role as a global leader.
Mm-hmm.
There's this feeling that maybe the U.S. needs to sort out its own problems before, lecturing other countries about their shortcomings.
Yeah, and it's not even just about these isolated incidents, right? It's like a broader trend of disillusionment with the transatlantic alliance, that partnership between the US and Europe. It's like a relationship that's going through a rough patch.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of right-wing populism surging globally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fueled by, nationalism, anti-immigration sentiment, this rejection of the traditional political establishments. These movements they're gaining ground, in Europe, in the U.S., all over the world. it suggests that maybe there's a bigger shift happening in the political landscape.
Yeah, so is this like just a temporary blip, right? Just a reaction to specific events? Or is it a sign of something more fundamental, like a realignment of global power dynamics, a rejection of the old order? I mean, these are questions that could have really profound implications for international relations going forward.
It's a really complex question, and there's no easy answer. We need to really look at these movements, understand why they're happening, and think about how they might change the global order in the years to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so let's bring it back to the U.S. for a second and talk about Elon Musk and this really ambitious DAGI initiative. Deregulate and automate just in time.
Right.
Right. So this plan aims to like streamline the government by like significantly reducing the federal workforce.
Okay.
On the surface it might sound appealing, right? Less bureaucracy, more efficiency, all that.
Yeah.
But there are some concerns about the potential consequences, especially when it comes to like essential government functions.
Right.
Like imagine air traffic control being privatized and automated.
Right.
Would you feel as safe flying knowing that those systems were in the hands of a private corporation?
That's a little scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder about accountability, right? Like, if something goes wrong, who's responsible? The government, the corporation. It just seems like a recipe for confusion, maybe even disaster.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid concern, right? There's a delicate balance between efficiency and effectiveness, right?
Yeah.
Between cutting costs and ensuring that things are done well.
Right.
And when it comes to, essential services like healthcare, education, disaster relief, I mean, we have to be really careful about just handing over control to private companies without the proper oversight.
Absolutely.
Without accountability.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got concerns about shrinking government, potential risks with privatization. Now, let's talk about how the public is reacting to all this, because there's a lot of unease out there.
Yeah.
We're seeing protests popping up all over the U.S. and they're targeting Tesla dealerships of all places.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it might seem kind of strange at first, right?
Yeah.
But these protests, they're actually a symptom of this like deeper discontent. People are connecting the dots between Musk's DAGL initiative, the impact it could have on federal workers, his growing political influence, especially his alignment with the Trump administration. They see Tesla as this symbol of this whole trend towards, corporate power, political influence, and they're pushing back.
So it's not just about Tesla, it's about something bigger.
Exactly. It's about this sense of anxiety
Right.
that people are feeling about, where things are headed.
Yeah.
They're feeling like they're losing control, like their voices aren't being heard,
Right.
and they're finding ways to express that frustration.
And it's a really smart way to do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're targeting a brand that's really visible. Tesla's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's symbolic. It's a clever strategy. It really speaks to the power of grassroots activism in this age of social media.
Yeah, it's a reminder that people are paying attention.
Mm.
They're willing to take a stand for what they believe in, even if it means, boycotting their favorite electric car.
Exactly. And it's a message to corporations.
Mm-hmm.
They can't just operate in a bubble anymore. They have to be aware of how people see their actions.
Right.
And be ready to face the consequences if they cross a line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears for a second and talk about something a little bit more somber.
Okay.
The recent stampedes in India.
Right.
That resulted in some really tragic loss of life. It's a stark reminder of how important crowd safety is, especially in countries with such dense populations.
Yeah, just picture yourself in a crowded train station, right?
Mm-hmm.
Surrounded by hundreds, thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly there's like this surge. People start panicking, they're pushing, they're shoving. There's just no control. It's terrifying. And unfortunately, we've been seeing it happen more and more often.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah, and these tragedies really highlight like the need for effective crowd management strategies, clear communication, really robust safety protocols. It's not just about preventing overcrowding. It's about having systems in place to make sure people are safe even when large crowds gather.
Yeah, and it's also about educating the public,
Right.
teaching people how to behave safely in those situations, to be aware of their surroundings, to know what to do if there's an emergency.
Yeah.
That can make a big difference.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a heartbreaking reminder that even with all the political maneuvering and technological advancements and all this stuff,
Right.
basic safety measures can literally mean the difference between life and death.
Absolutely.
It's a real call to action to prioritize safety and to invest in the kind of infrastructure and training that we need to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
I agree.
All right, so let's head back to the international stage for a minute. We're seeing the ripple effects of, well, some people say it's a U.S. withdrawal from Europe, right? And Zelensky's call for a European army. It's really stirred up this whole debate about the future of European security.
Yeah, the reactions to that idea are pretty interesting. Some people see it as a necessary step. Like Europe needs to be more independent, right? They can't rely so much on the U.S. for protection anymore. But then others, they think it's risky. Could undermine NATO, maybe even create more division within Europe.
Yeah. The Polish defense minister, for example, he wasn't too thrilled about it.
Right.
He was pointing out all the practical challenges, right?
Yeah.
Of trying to create this unified European military force, especially when you think about, all the different interests, all the historical baggage that these European nations have.
It's a lot to overcome. I mean, just imagine trying to integrate all the different military doctrines, different equipment, different command structures. It'd be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Not to mention the politics of it all. I mean, some countries, they might not want to give up control of their own defense forces, to some supranational entity.
Right. It's like herding cats, right?
Exactly.
Everyone's trying to go in a different direction. But it does raise the question, what does the future hold for NATO? If the US is pulling back, will Europe feel like they have to step up?
Yeah, it's possible. And if Europe does start to, go its own way, it could really create a rift between the U.S. and its allies.
Right.
And potentially weaken, the Western Bloc's ability to respond to all these global challenges.
Yeah. Speaking of challenges, there's a somber update on that Mini Cooper incident in Germany, the one where the driver, rammed into a group of protesters.
Right.
So tragically, there have been 2 fatalities: a 33-year-old woman and her 2-year-old daughter.
Oh, that's terrible.
It's just a heartbreaking reminder of the human costs of violence.
Yeah.
And the fragility of life.
Yeah, and it just adds another layer of complexity to this whole, already sensitive issue of refugees in Europe.
Right.
I mean, we know now that the perpetrator, he was an Afghan asylum seeker. But the authorities, they've said there's no connection to terrorism. Still, this incident, it's likely to fuel anti-immigration sentiment. And it will raise questions about, how refugees are being integrated into these European societies.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act, right?
It is.
I mean, we want to be compassionate. We want to be welcoming to people who are fleeing conflict, persecution. But at the same time, we also have to, make sure our citizens are safe and secure.
Absolutely.
So how do we navigate that tension?
Yeah, it's a question that needs, a lot of thought, a lot of nuance. It's about, addressing those real security concerns while also staying true to our values.
Right.
Human rights, compassion, it's about creating a space where integration and understanding can happen.
Right.
But also recognizing that there are always going to be, challenges and complexities along the way.
Yeah, it's about trying to build a more inclusive and tolerant society,
Yeah.
Even when there's so much fear and uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention back to the U.S. for a moment. There's a development in the healthcare sector that's raising some eyebrows.
Okay.
So the Trump administration has apparently fired thousands of FDA employees.
Wow.
And the timing of it is a little suspicious, right? It happened on a Saturday evening, almost like they were trying to bury the news.
And it's not just the timing, it's what it means for the FDA, their ability to actually do their job, which is, making sure that the drugs we take are safe, that the medical devices we use are effective.
Right.
I mean, we could be talking about delays in device approvals, disruption of essential functions, like equipment maintenance, things like that. And then there are the really critical areas like radiation health services. Those could be set back.
Yeah, it almost feels like they're intentionally trying to weaken the very agency that's supposed to be protecting us.
Yeah.
From potentially harmful products, harmful practices.
It raises a lot of questions about, what this administration really cares about.
Mm-hmm.
Are they truly committed to public health?
Right.
I mean, isn't that like one of the most basic things the government should do?
Right.
Protect its citizens from harm.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like a fundamental role of government.
Right.
And these layoffs, it's like a really troubling signal. It's almost like they're saying, we don't really care if the drugs you take are safe. We don't care if the medical devices you rely on have been properly tested. I mean, it's like they're gambling with people's lives.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got concerns about public health, and now let's add economic anxieties to that. A lot of American small businesses, they're feeling the squeeze, and they're saying it's because of the Trump administration's policies, specifically the recent surge in executive orders and the rising interest rates.
It's a tough time to be a small business owner, that's for sure. You've got rising costs, consumers are hesitant to spend, and there's just so much uncertainty about the future.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for economic problems. I mean, small businesses, they're the backbone of this country. If they start struggling, the effects could be huge.
Right.
We could see job losses, businesses closing left and right. The whole economy could slow down significantly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the numbers. It's about real people, their livelihoods,
Right.
their dreams, their ability to take care of their families. These policies, they have real-world consequences. And it's often everyday Americans who end up paying the price.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny. We started this whole deep dive talking about those winter storms and the role of FEMA in disaster relief.
Right.
Well, there's actually a pretty unsettling connection to that. Remember Elon Musk's DJI initiative, the one that's all about shrinking the federal workforce? Well, it looks like those layoffs have reached FEMA.
Oh, wow.
And people are not happy about it. Critics are saying that this is like the worst possible time for this to happen.
Yeah.
FEMA's already stretched thin responding to all these disasters. Like they're purposely trying to sabotage the very agency that's supposed to be helping people recover from these events.
That's really concerning. And it's not just about the immediate response. It's about FEMA's ability to prepare for the future. To build resilience, to make sure they have the resources, the people they need to handle whatever comes next.
Right.
These layoffs, they could have consequences for years to come when it comes to disaster preparedness.
Yeah, it all comes back to that question of priorities, right?
Right.
Are we putting short-term cost savings ahead of long-term security, long-term well-being? Are we willing to gamble with people's lives, their livelihoods, just to have a smaller government? These are questions that we really need to be thinking about.
They're big questions.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Political maneuvering, economic anxieties, international tensions, even, the ethical implications of all this new technology. It's been a whirlwind of current events, and I think it's safe to say we're living in a time of really rapid change and a lot of uncertainty.
There's no doubt about that. But, even though all this uncertainty can be a little scary, it can also be a chance for positive change. It's a time to really look at what we believe, to challenge the way things are, to demand better from our leaders. It's a time for real conversation, to listen to each other, to try and build a future that's fairer, more just, more sustainable.
Well said. I think that's a great point to end on. We've explored a lot of complex issues, and there aren't any easy answers. But I think the key takeaway is this. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay hopeful. The future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, keep those minds curious, keep those conversations flowing.